Good evening, and thank you for tuning in for tonight's live stream of Maine Voices Live Waterville. I'm Jody Jalbert, Group Vice President of Advertising for the Morning Sentinel and Kennebec Journal. If you'd like, please open the chat window to your right, adjust the settings so everyone can see what you'd like to say, and let us know where you're tuning in from. We had really hoped to see you in person at Colby's amazing auditorium, and we will soon, but right now we'd like to thank Colby College for supporting this event. We wish the college and its graduates the best following their multi-day end of semester celebration this past weekend. We're thrilled to have two titans of Maine journalism who are also exceptional chroniclers of the state's stories and history. Both men likely need no introduction, but here are some quick points about each of them. Bill Nemitz has worked as a journalist in Maine for more than 4 decades, starting out as a reporter for the Morning Sentinel in Waterville. He started writing his popular Portland Press Herald column in 1995. Bill's work has taken him across the globe, including to Iraq and Afghanistan, Northern Ireland, Manhattan in the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina, and to Haiti following the 2010 earthquake. Bill was inducted into the Maine Press Association's Hall of Fame in 2015. He lives in Buxton with his family. Joe Owen is the author of the feature On This Date in Maine History, which runs daily in recognition of Maine's bicentennial in the Kennebec Journal, Morning Sentinel, Sun Journal, and Portland Press Herald. Before retiring, Joe worked on and off in Maine journalism for 40 years, starting out as a Kennebec Journal reporter, then copy editor and night editor for both Central Maine newspapers and the Portland Press Herald. In between stints at Maine papers, he was also a reporter for European Stars and Stripes in Germany and for Pacific Stars and Stripes in Japan. Joe is a longtime board member of the Kennebec Historical Society, and he lives in Augusta. His new book, This Day in Maine, is based on his research as part of Maine's bicentennial, and it published just this last month. We'll include a promo code to purchase the book in both the Zoom chat window here this evening and again in a follow-up email. The first 45 minutes of tonight's program will be their conversation, and then we'll open up to the audience questions. You can submit by either entering in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or later you'll be able to use the raise your hand function and ask your question live. But now, please join me in welcoming our guests to the live stream, Bill and Joe.
How are you?
Feeling pretty good for a Titan.
Well, we're all in this together. In fact, you and I have been in it together for a long time. When I started at the Sentinel, you were at the KJ.
Was.
We go back that far. So, hey, I want to start. We're going to talk a lot about your book tonight and about the series that's been running since January. But before we do that, I just thought we'd kind of set the scene a little bit by talking about you, which I'm sure you're anxious to do. You are a lifelong historian. You're one of those people that loves looking.
Not yet.
Not yet. One of those people who loves looking back. Where did that come from? When did your love of history begin?
Oh, I think I've always been interested in it, but I'm a bit reluctant to be called a historian. I prefer to think of myself as a taxi driver for other historians' work. Brought it to the attention of people who might otherwise not have seen it. I did not major in history in college, and I did only average work in my history classes when I took them. But after I got into journalism, I got interested in it for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is that I started looking into my family background and started making connections between what had happened to my relatives and what was going on in history at the time. It makes it a lot easier to put those things into perspective when you know what the historical background is.
Mm-hmm.
So I moved overseas, as was mentioned earlier, for 13 years. And when I came back, I developed a new appreciation for the area where I grew up and started looking into it more.
I was in Augusta, correct? You grew up?
In Augusta. I grew up in Augusta. And I got involved with the Kennebec Historical Society at the encouragement of a friend of mine up here. And one thing led to another, and here we are.
Well, what was it, about a year ago, roughly, that we were all in another world, and everybody was thinking about this bicentennial that was coming up, and
Yes.
all the newspapers, including ours, were trying to think of ways we were going to cover this thing, and so, you know, what might catch people's attention, keeps people's interest. And you were involved at the start. Tell us what happened. How did this series, how was it born?
Our managing editor came to me, Scott Monroe, and asked whether I would be willing to participate in the committee that was going to plan the bicentennial observance for the newspaper chain. And I said, sure. I said, I'm planning to retire in July, but I'm still willing to do something to help make that happen. So we had an initial conversation, I think, and then I retired. At the initial conversation, I said, why don't we just put something in the paper every day that commemorates something that happened on that date sometime in Maine history or in connection with somebody from Maine. So they essentially said, that sounds like a great idea. When can you do it? No, I didn't mean I would do it all. And as it turned out, I didn't do it all. I did all the writing, or almost all the writing, and the research. But I had a lot of help from, for example, Julie McHugh, who arranged for the photographs and other artwork that went with the daily column in the paper. And from Dean Lunt, the publisher at Islandport Press, who helped gather images for publication in the book.
Which we'll be talking about in a little bit. That's kind of a nice offshoot of all of this. It sounded, I'll bet at that meeting, it sounded so easy, right? It was, hey, one a day?
Sure, I like history. I know stuff. So, well, it turned out I didn't know quite as much as I thought I did. And the hardest part, of course, was nailing down something for every single date. Because after a while, when you first start looking, you find things one right after the other, and you add them up. But then you keep running across things for the dates that you've already covered, and you can't get those last few dates.
Mm-hmm.
So what I ended up having to do was go to the state library and look up microfilm copies of the Portland Press Herald and the Bangor Daily News and other papers.
How did you do that? I can't last 5 minutes in front of one of those machines before I either fall asleep.
Coffee.
Huh?
I said, I don't even drink coffee.
So you just pick like a month and scroll through, and I assume check the front.
Go back to the previous year, nothing there, go back to the previous year until I find something that's vaguely interesting.
Did you only look at the front pages? Pretty much?
You get to look at the whole paper.
Wow. Really?
It's pretty much.
So that was your primary source, would you say?
A primary source. And there
what were some of the others?
There were collections of stories. Well, one thing is a book by Douglas Stover that's called Eminent Mainers, I believe it is. It's a miniature biographies of people from all throughout Maine history. There are hundreds of them in there. And by going through that, I was able to find out what those people did, and then I have to go look elsewhere to flesh out their accomplishments. And then other examples would be various compilations of interesting stories about Maine history. Some are about military figures, some are about quacks and charlatans, some are about disasters that occurred in Maine. And for others, I had to look at specific histories. I have a bibliography in the back of the book that's about 7 or 8 pages long. It's a much abbreviated list of all of the sources that I consulted. There are hundreds of them.
So you did a lot of reading.
I did, but
how much reading versus how much writing? I mean, relative to the workload. It sounds like you spent a lot more time researching than you probably did.
I did. I would say probably 3 times as much researching and taking notes as I did writing. And
tell me about those days that you ended up having too much stuff. Too many good things happened on one day.
Well, at least for the newspaper's purposes and also for the book, it wasn't a problem because we have multiple entries for a single day. That's okay. I guess the difficult part would be when you've got 3 or 4 really interesting things that need to be done in detail, you have to edit them down so that it doesn't chew up a whole lot of space. And that's all, that was also the situation in the book.
These things are pretty tight,
Yes.
pretty tightly written. Yeah. Let's talk about some of them. We spoke, and of course I did the column on this back in March, just before we all went home. And the one I can't get out of my mind is the elephant. It's one of those stories that's just burned on my brain now that I've heard it. Tell us about the circus elephant.
I'm gonna put the cover of the book up for now while you can see that. The elephant. Let's see. That's about a sinking of a ship called the Royal Tar, and the item is not too long. I can read it to you. It occurred on October 25th, 1836. The passenger steamship Royal Tar, heading from St. John, New Brunswick to Portland, burns and sinks in Penobscot Bay while carrying a variety of circus animals, as well as 72 passengers and 21 crew members. 32 people and most of the animals die in the sinking. 2 of the ship's 4 lifeboats were removed to make room for the animals. The 164-foot-long Royal Tar was built in St. John and was completed earlier that year. It departed St. John on October 21st, carrying an elephant named Mogul, a Bengal tiger, 2 lions, 2 camels, 6 Arabian horses, some monkeys, and a variety of other exotic animals. The menagerie comprises a traveling circus bearing the ungainly name of Dexter's Locomotive Museum and Berger's Collection of Serpents and Birds. Also traveling on the ship are a brass band, a large collection of waxworks, a 2-ton show wagon called an omnibus, several other wagons, and other horses. The circus had been touring New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Windy weather prompted the Royal Tar to dock at Eastport, then twice more. It departed from Machias on October 25th, heading southwest. When the ship is near the island of Vinyl Haven, a fire breaks out below deck. Dense smoke prevents access to the pumps, which also are below deck. The first engineer and 15 other men jump into one of the 2 remaining boats, a longboat, and row away, finally reaching Isle au Haut, 7 miles distant. The captain and 2 other men lower the other boat, a jolly boat, a small vessel meant to ferry passengers back and forth between a larger ship and land, into the water to prevent it from burning. By this time, the middle of the Royal Tar is engulfed in flames. This is one of my favorite parts. One passenger ties a stocking loaded with silver dollars around his waist and lowers himself into the water. He immediately sinks out of sight. The pilot
Why am I laughing?
The pilot from the nearby U.S. revenue cutter Vito approaches in a rowboat, then panics at the sight of the chaos on the Royal Tar and rows back. The Vito draws nearer and rescues 40 people, costing its captain severe wounds and burns. The Vito itself also catches fire twice. Eventually, Mogul, the elephant, standing on deck throughout the fire, crashes through the ship's rail and falls to the water, taking some unfortunate passengers with him. Of all the fatalities, 31 people drown and 1 is burned to death. The name of the Royal Tar is the nickname of Britain's King William IV. The nickname is a reference to William's extensive service in the British Navy. So, yeah, not a ship writing.
Long live Bobo. Was it Bobo? Yeah.
Mogul.
Oh, okay. Wow. I just can't imagine what it must have been like to be in another vessel coming upon that and witnessing that.
I don't think I would have wanted to have been on that ship, even if it didn't catch fire.
Exactly. Now, it's interesting, as you read that, you read these and you wrote these all in the present tense.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
It just seemed like a more natural thing that gave it a sense of immediacy, as though you're watching it happen. And there are other examples of the use of the present tense that way in newspapers, for example, in photo captions.
Yep.
Those are all written in the
It reminds me of the old newsreels too. Those at the movie theaters, they'd always do that. It was happening right before your eyes.
But I might add that I did get one criticism from a reader who said that didn't make sense. Why don't you write in the past tense? And, it was too late. We'd already started.
It was the cat was out of the barn.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing I've noticed is you've had some very current things in there, including Janet Mills' inauguration.
Yes.
I believe you made note of. And I know there were some people who got on you about that, saying, wait a minute, that's not history, that just happened. I think you would disagree with that.
I do disagree with it. I mean, we're living through history right now. Should I not have written about the coronavirus, which is affecting people all over the world, including here in Maine? I don't think so. And I also wanted to bear in mind that some people reading the book would be reading it 10 or 15 years from now, and presumably might not have been aware of what was happening in Maine at that time. So it is history to a future reader.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also history to younger people who take time to develop an awareness of the political context of things and might not appreciate it at first pass.
You know, speaking of the pandemic that we're going through right now, and as you said, you know, Maine history is being made right under our feet. It's kind of strange that 100 years ago, in Maine's first centennial, we were coming out of the same thing. How relative to how big a deal it is now, as you went through those papers of that time, was it as, you know, all encompassing as it is right now? Was it all people talked about, or was the world a different place then?
It was for major wars. World War I, World War II were usually on the front page every day when that was happening. I did not spend a lot of time looking at the pandemic of 1918 and 1919 for a couple of reasons. One is I wasn't able to determine that it had a specific influence on Maine that differed greatly from other places. And the second reason was that I didn't have the reminder of at the start of the project of the coronavirus, because that didn't really capture the public's attention until I was well into getting this thing done. Mm-hmm. So I did mention something about that, but not about the Spanish flu epidemic. Mm-hmm. It is the great hidden historical event. People have wiped it from their consciousnesses, and I find that amazing. I had a great uncle who was in World War I, who died shortly after the armistice was signed in November 1918, and I think he died of the Spanish flu, but it wasn't ever spelled out specifically.
Yeah, I noticed that. I just wrote this past weekend about, you know, the Maine's bicentennial celebration and how it's all kind of been postponed until next year. But I got hold of the copy of the very voluminous 60-page program for Portland's celebration of the centennial, and this was 1920, and there were still even residual cases of the flu pandemic back then. Yet, and I looked hard, and I could find no mention anywhere in that 60-page document of what the country and what the world had just gone through. So I guess people like to move on from these things quickly once they're over.
I think we're seeing evidence of that on TV right now.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing I noticed is that as I was reading through some of the entries, I was wondering, I was amazed that Maine is not nothing but cinders, because we had
yeah, that's true. Major fires.
Oh my God, every time you turn around, there's another big fire.
I developed a strong appreciation for the progress that's been made in firefighting equipment and tactics, because I've never really experienced anything of that magnitude in my lifetime. A few buildings here and there, but entire downtowns burning down, never seen that.
Tell us about the worst one.
Well, the worst one definitely was in Portland. That happened on the 4th of July, 1866, when kids were playing with firecrackers, and one of them ignited something down by the waterfront, and it ended up burning up about half to 2/3 of downtown Portland. And it resulted in a massive refugee problem. People who were suddenly homeless were camping on tents up on Monjoy Hill, which in those days didn't have anywhere near as many buildings on it. And interestingly, that fire burned a path through downtown Portland that pretty much mimicked the destruction of Portland in 1775, when Captain Mowat and the British forces parked in Portland Harbor unleashed a volley of fire bombs on the city.
Mm. And then there was the big one, was it 40, 47? Was it 47?
47 was a statewide problem. It was a result of a drought that had afflicted pretty much the whole southern part of the state. And there were two towns in York County that were essentially wiped out, Shapley and Buxton, I think.
Hey, I live in Buxton. Be careful with that.
Yeah. It might not be Buxton. I know Shapley was one of them.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Towns now, and you're aware of architectural history, you'll realize that everything's a lot newer than 1947.
Yeah, no question about it. But, you know, it kind of proves
the other big place.
Oh, yeah. It proves the theory that, you know, bad news often leads.
That's right. Exactly.
Because you have a lot of calamities in there.
Yes. Shipwrecks, an earthquake, hurricanes, major traffic accidents, plane crashes, fires, blizzards, and multiple versions of all of those, except there's only one earthquake I've got in there.
How did you keep all this straight? How did you organize, you know, logistically, how did you organize all this stuff? I'm
not sure I did. Well, I kept extensive notes. I have a big binder that I've got, you can't see it in the room here, but right over there, I've got this milk crate that's full of files for each of the months of the year. And I put copies of news stories or notes in each of those folders so that I can keep track of them.
I think I'd have nightmares after a while.
And then I had an electronic file, because the hardest part is remembering what day to look at when I've got to go back and review something. So I have an electronic file and just do a word search for a keyword, and I find the file pretty quickly.
Now, as a fellow journalist, I know the art of procrastination and the power of the deadline. When did you actually get around to writing this stuff? I'll bet it wasn't last summer.
No, I probably began writing it in earnest in early November. And at that point, we weren't thinking about making a book out of it. But once I got about 2/3 of the entries done, I thought, this is a lot of stuff. Maybe it should be a book. And fortunately, Lisa DeSisto agreed, and she put me in contact with Dean Blunt at Island Park Press, and it all fell into place. And Dean basically set parameters that made me do this faster, because he had to have it all done in order to be able to market it to the summertime audience. Otherwise, I'd probably still be twiddling my thumbs and getting a month done at a time.
Right.
Whereas as it is now, I've got the whole year done.
You are done. Good for you. That's unbelievable. Of course, those summertime readers, they're going to have a lot more time on their hands this summer.
I was pretty much done with the first draft by the end of January.
Okay.
There's been additional work that had to be done since then, partly because Dean suggested changes and additional research on a few things. And then the coronavirus, that required its own item be put in, things like that.
So how are you handling that in the book, the coronavirus?
I think the cutoff was sometime in mid-April. I just took the latest figures for whatever they were then, which are far lower than they are now, obviously.
Yeah.
And
who knows where that's going
the second edition, I'll have to update it.
I was looking at some of the questions that some of our audience have submitted earlier, and a lot of them are superlative in nature. You know, what's the most or the biggest or the best? Let me ask you, who in your opinion, if you had to pick one person who had the biggest impact on the state of Maine, who would it be? I know there are many contenders, but
the biggest impact. That's a tough question. I'm going to answer a different one. Pretend you didn't ask that. I'm going to tell you the guy I'd like to sit down and talk with about his escapades, and that is Evan Kleitz. Now, bear in mind, I spent time in Germany, so maybe I'm prejudiced in this regard. But Evan Kleitz was fascinating. He's the guy who, back in the 1970s, was flying on vacation to San Francisco. He didn't speak any English. The plane stopped in Bangor for refueling, and he thought that was the end of his flight, so he got off. He spent a few days wandering around Bangor trying to find somebody to communicate with and asking where the Golden Gate Bridge and other San Francisco landmarks were, and getting no results, until he finally ran across a cafe owner up in Old Town who could speak German. She was from Germany originally. She says, no, you are not in San Francisco. He says, well, I'm here now. I might as well, enjoy it. And he became a local celebrity. He dedicated the opening of the Bangor Mall. He was the guest of honor at various fraternal organizations. He was invited down to Augusta to meet the governor, and then he went home. And then he went, I can't remember whether he went on to San Francisco on that same trip or he went later. I think he went later, but in any event, when he got back home from San Francisco, people asked him what he thought, and he said, I like Bangor better.
Oh, we must have, do we have a monument to him or anything? No acknowledgement that he was here?
Not that I know of, other than in what you can find in the archives of the Bangor Daily News.
Oh, okay. How about, how many times does Joshua Chamberlain appear in your book?
Probably 5 or 6 times. He also appears on the cover of the book, and this gives me an opportunity to mention who else is on there. And the reason I want to do that is to explain how a lot of this, for me, and as I think should be for other historians, is deeply personal. You see, let's see, 5 images on the cover. And I have a personal connection to 4 of them. Top one is the explosion of the battleship Maine. It's a artist's conception of it in Havana Harbor in 1898. My grandmother's brother-in-law was a commander of an army unit in Rockland and went to Cuba when the United States declared war on Spain. In the top right, and then the lower quadrant of where there are 4 photos, you'll see a picture of Samantha Smith. Samantha was from Manchester. To bring people up to speed, if you don't know who she was, she was a schoolgirl who wrote a letter to the leader of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, asking why the Soviet Union is not interested in peace with the United States. Surprisingly, he wrote back to her. And he said, we are interested in peace, and I invite you to our country to see what we're like. So she and her parents went on a much publicized trip to the Soviet Union in the early 1980s, and she became a worldwide celebrity as a result of that. She died 2 years later in a plane crash when she was on her way back from England, where she'd been filming a TV show in which Robert Wagner was starring, and she played his daughter. But before she went to the Soviet Union, I met her. I ended up doing a story about her collecting knickknacks, little souvenirs to take to the Soviet Union to give away to people as mementos of Maine. And a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine, was the first person to write a story about her. And I always introduce him to people that way. I think he's getting tired of it. Joshua Chamberlain, whom you mentioned earlier, is buried in the Pine Grove Cemetery in Brunswick. And there's a photo I have queued up that shows his gravestone there. This is one of 2 gravestones that Joshua Chamberlain has. This is his official Army stone. And then immediately to the right of that is a vertical stone that's the family stone. His name is on that as well. I have a connection to that, not because I have any relationship to him, but I've got relatives who were in the Civil War and who were not famous, but had tragic tales to tell. And I have relatives in that same cemetery where Chamberlain is buried. Literally a stone's throw from his gravestone is the burial site of my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Philip Owen, who was in Washington's army during the Revolutionary War and who was present at the execution of British Major John Andrea, who was working with Benedict Arnold when Arnold was trying to turn over West Point to the British forces when he turned against the Americans. And he watched him be executed. And he was also at Valley Forge. So this is one of the reasons I get interested in history, because it helps explain a lot about how I ended up being who I was. Down in the lower right corner, you'll see a photograph of the Double Eagle II, the first balloon that crossed the Atlantic Ocean and landed successfully in Europe. It left from Presque Isle in 1978, carrying 3 passengers, and landed in a place called Miseré in France. As a result, it left from Presque Isle, and there's a park there that commemorates that feat. And I spent a lot of time in Presque Isle over the years because my mother-in-law was from Easton, the town immediately to the east of Presque Isle, and we went there, saw the monument, and I learned a lot about that as a result. I don't have any connection to the ship photo, which was about the Battle of the Margareta, I think, in Machias. So I think that's one of the big motivations for me to do this, is that it helps me to merge my awareness of what my family was doing at various times with what was going on around them. And
yeah, and you can see them living their lives through the research, in other words.
Yes.
Yeah. Huh. Have you ever thought about writing a historical novel?
A long time ago I did. I read a lot of Kenneth Roberts, but I'm much more interested in what actually happened. I'm more interested in writing nonfiction. I'm a big fan of writers like David McCullough, who managed to popularize what could otherwise be a dry subject. And
my favorite is the Johnstown Flood.
I haven't read that one.
You got to read it. It's great.
I read his Truman biography, and I've read his book about the Americans in Paris in the 19th century, one of whom was Elihu Washburn. I have him in the book. He was the U.S. minister to France when the Germans defeated France during the Franco-Prussian War, and then the Communards took over and created wide-scale chaos, far worse than the French Revolution in 1870. He was sheltering people in the American embassy so that they wouldn't be killed. It was quite an amazing story. And he wrote a journal about it while he was there.
You know, it's interesting, as you talk about your research, I think about the state of newspapers at various times during Maine's history, and talk about that. I mean, you were really seeing the mirrors of the times every time you scrolled onto one of those papers.
Yes.
Was journalism different, say 100, 200 years ago?
Yes, and then if you go back 50 years before that, it was different yet again. Libel laws were not the same as they are now, so people get away with calling each other just awful things without worrying about being sued over it. But I think one of the things that strikes me about newspapers of 100 or 150 years ago is that they were strongly partisan in their reporting. It's not as easy to do. When we talk about ourselves living in a partisan era today, we're, Republican versus Democrat, left versus right, conservative versus liberal. But the newspaper evidence of that divide was much greater back then. If you read an account of something, for example, in the Portland Eastern Argus, which was a prominent daily newspaper from the time of in the late 19th century, and then you read the same story in a competitor's newspaper, it was as though you were looking at two completely different events that happened.
It's kind of like MSNBC and Fox News, huh?
Well, I thought we were talking about newspapers, but yes.
Well, tell me, what was the one story that something you maybe didn't know before you started your research that just shocked you the most?
Yeah, let's see.
Just knocked your socks off.
That probably would be the gold scheme in Lubeck. There was a group of men who they did swindle more than $1 million from various investors by convincing them that they had perfected a method for extracting gold from seawater. And they did a dry run of this for some investors, not in Lubec, it was elsewhere.
What era are we talking here?
It's about 100 years ago.
Okay.
They brought the investors to the end of a pier. They had lowered some a crate containing some other metal, I forget what it was, into the water. And when they brought it back up, there was gold in there. But what the investors didn't know was that one of the scam artists was a professional diver, and he'd gone down and substituted the gold for the metal. And they said, wow, this is great. And they poured money into it. And then they began a large-scale operation in Lubec. They picked Lubec. I thought it would be because of the tides or something, washing in and out. But they did that because it was so far away, they figured most of the people who invested in this wouldn't take the trouble to go up there and inspect the place.
And they could always escape to Canada.
Well, one of them escaped to France, and the other one just vanished.
We'll never know, right?
One who escaped to France finally ended up paying back some of the money, but most of the investors only got about 25 cents on the dollar for their investments.
Well, there's one more in every minute, right?
Right.
We're going to go to questions in a minute, but when you finished, I'm thinking of you before you started this and when you finished it, how much your appreciation for Maine changed or didn't? Did this just confirm what you felt all along, or where did it leave you in looking at this state over 200 years?
I think I appreciate it a lot more. There's so much detail. I mean, it's only natural that we would overlook a lot of what happened in the past because we're so consumed with what goes on in our lives right now.
Mm-hmm.
But we have had an impressive array of inventors, scientists, swindlers, politicians. I didn't mean to put those two so close together. Military leaders, religious.
Just rolls off the tongue, right?
Yes, it's quite an impressive spectacle when you put it all together, and I think that we have a lot to be proud of and a lot to be ashamed of, but much to be aware of. That's the main thing that has helped to create this fascinating social web that exists here, and a lot of the things that we take for granted on a day-to-day basis, such as, for example, the establishment of Baxter State Park, where my family goes almost every summer. That wouldn't have happened if some guy hadn't taken the trouble, Percival Baxter, to buy up all the land and donate it to the state because he couldn't convince the legislature to do it.
Yeah, talk about vision.
And we all benefit from that.
Yeah, and we still do to this day. He's a real hero, no question about it. Do we have any questions? I'm going to check and see if we have any questions ready to go.
Yeah, we do actually have someone with their hand up. Mary Allen, you are good to ask your question.
Wow, I didn't know I'd be picked on. Thank you so much. Your stories are fascinating, but the question I wrote and submitted was something along the lines of, I didn't pay attention to Maine history when I was in high school. The function of perhaps my other interests or the teachers, but as I age, I'm finding myself more and more drawn to Maine history. I like the segments on NPR where they talk for a minute or two about Maine history. And you have this amazing way of making these stories, I'll call them, but they're truths, but they're stories. And you have this marvelous way of making them come alive for me. And perhaps that would have helped me in high school, but at least I'm getting back to that subject and find it fascinating. I wonder if you have any comments about how could we do a better job reaching young people about some of these things, because the way you tell history, the way you talk about it is fascinating.
I think
you make it come alive is what I guess is a good way of putting it.
I think the writing's not enough. I think that probably a good way to make it come alive for young people is to take them to the places where some of these things happen. And you can be anywhere in the state and be close to a dozen of them. The book that I put together has representative samples from all over Maine. I didn't get anything from Milo or Winnipitlock, and they'll have to suffer through that. But most areas are covered. And if a history teacher were to arrange a field trip to some of these things, it would bring people into closer contact with it. But the writing helps too. I mean, I spent, as Bill knows, I spent 18 years as a newspaper reporter, and that was a good training for writing tightly, concisely, and grabbing people's interest right off the bat. And I tried to do that with each of those items.
Keeping these as short as they are, though, must have been a challenge.
It was. You had to throw out a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Which, and the book, I assume the book enables you to elaborate a little bit more.
Not much more.
No?
No, because there are about 600 items in there.
We're always looking for more length, you know what I mean? It's just you can't get it enough. I have a question here from Patsy Crockett, and she wants to know, among other things, if you could have dinner with any famous person from a time prior to the 1900s, who would it be and why?
I'm going to assume she means somebody from Maine.
Yeah. We'll go with that.
First of all, a disclaimer, I know Patsy very well. She's a friend of mine. She's also the president currently of the Kennebec Historical Society. So we see each other at least.
Okay.
I would say probably Percival Baxter would be the person I'd like to talk to, because of what we discussed earlier about the park, but because he was multifaceted. He had lots of other interests as well. And he was acutely aware of the importance of Maine history because his father, James Finney Baxter, who was mayor of Portland, was a historian himself. So he was exposed to that growing up.
Any other hands up? Let's see if I can't see any.
We
raised
don't have any hands up right now.
Okay. I have an interesting question here about the time that when Maine became Maine and split from Massachusetts. Linda McClune notes many Mainers wanted to remain part of Massachusetts. It wasn't a slam dunk. Did you come across any of that, the debate over Maine statehood?
This is another example of something I really didn't know about until I started doing the research. I read a book by Ronald Banks called Maine Becomes a State, and it was published around the time of Maine's sesquicentennial in 1970. And it explains that the movement toward Maine statehood really was a long, drawn-out process that lasted 35 years. It began in 1785 with the publication of the first issue of the Falmouth Gazette. Falmouth was the old name of Portland. And in that first issue, there was a call for a meeting to talk about statehood. And there are a variety of reasons why it didn't happen. One reason was there was unrest in Western Massachusetts, Shays Rebellion, and other backcountry skirmishes. So people in Maine said, well, we don't want to do anything to upset the apple cart while that's going on. Let's hold off. Then there was the introduction of the coasting law, which is a really bizarre law passed in the early 19th century that required ships that are transporting goods to pay a duty at any state that does not, let's see how this goes, that doesn't border the state that they're coming from. So a ship leaving from Portland would not have to pay a duty in New Hampshire because that's right next to Maine. It wouldn't have to pay it in Massachusetts because Maine was part of Massachusetts. It wouldn't have to pay in Rhode Island, Connecticut, or New York because Massachusetts touches all of those states. But once it got to New Jersey, it would have to start paying. If Maine had become a state, while the coasting law was still in effect, Maine would have started having to pay in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. So the business interests in Portland were against statehood at that point. The thing that probably really pushed it over the edge, that convinced most people to do it, was the War of 1812, because the British occupied about 1/3 of Maine along the eastern coast for several months. And the Massachusetts legislature either could not or would not do anything to evict them. And the federal government was too busy elsewhere fighting the British in Washington and who knows where. So once the war ended, a lot of people in Maine decided we don't ever want this to happen again, and we need to take control of our own destiny. And the coasting law was repealed.
I have a question here from our old friend Cindy Stevens. And she raises another very prominent name here in Maine. Given the Guy Gannett family's long history of journalism in Maine, are they mentioned in the book? You're on the hot seat now, Joe.
They certainly are. And this is good to cue up another photo, the one of Howard Hill. The Gannett family has a long reputation in Maine, starting with William Howard Gannett. And they own this piece of property that you see here. This is a view of the state complex from Howard Hill, which was recently made available to the public. I mean, the view was, because certain trees were cut down and a stone bench was put up there. It became conservation land and recreation land, supposedly in perpetuity. And it's called Howard Hill because the Howard family, which owned and operated Fort Western back in the 18th century, eventually acquired that property as well. William Howard Gannett became wealthy because he published Comfort magazine for more than 50 years, and because he sold quack mineral water called Giant Oxy or Oxyon. And the two businesses kind of fed off each other. If you bought a lot of water, you get a subscription to the magazine, or if you bought the magazine, you get coupons for the water. It made him wealthy. He had a mansion on Western Avenue, and his land extended far up the hill and included the view that you just saw. His son, Guy Gannett, started the newspaper chain. He bought up the Portland Press Herald, the Kennebec Journal, the Morning Sentinel, and then established a number of radio and television stations as well. He lived in Augusta at first, but then he moved to Portland because when he bought the Press Herald, that was clearly where most of his business interests lay. And they owned the paper for decades. So I mentioned the family both in the context of their journalistic heritage and also in their connections to the property that you took a picture of.
Guy Gannett died the year I was born.
1953.
Oh, I thought it was 54. Close enough.
53 or 54, right?
Right. It's an interesting one. I think it's anonymous, but were there one or more people in whom you were so interested or so intrigued that you went deep down the rabbit hole about them, going a lot further than you really needed to?
I think there probably were. Bearing in mind, I knew I had to move on and get other stuff done. Probably one good example of that, and I've got a few mentions of him, was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's grandfather, Peleg Wadsworth. He was a pretty interesting character. He escaped from imprisonment by the British during the Revolutionary War. He he conducted the last military execution in Maine by hanging a man who had cooperated with the British. And then, of course, he was Longfellow's grandfather too. So
Right.
they're a little tie.
Yeah, I can see where you'd not want to put that down. Did Maine have this is from Jim Peacock, I'm sorry, I can't see the type. Did Maine have a part in the Underground Railroad?
It did. I don't think I mentioned that in the book because that's something that's pretty hard to affix a date to, and that's key. I had to have a date for everything. For many people, I couldn't find any dates about, for example, it was pretty tough to get one for Andrew Wyeth because he was painting, but I had his birth date and his death date, so I used one of those. But with the Underground Railroad, it's such a, by its very nature, was a hidden operation. It was hard to hang it on any one thing.
Yeah, it wasn't in the newspapers, that's for sure.
Right. There's a house right here in Augusta that was on the Underground Railroad. There's another one just over the city line in the town of Vassalboro that's quite palatial in its appearance. It's got Corinthian columns on the front of it and faces the US Route 201. But because I was not able to find a date, I didn't dig really deeply into that.
Another good question here from Allison McCann. I'll preface it by saying when you were talking about Samantha Smith earlier, I was having a vivid flashback of being awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning by an editor the morning the plane crashed, and hopping in my car, driving up to Auburn. And just as around dawn, finally, we were all out at the site and were allowed in. And it was just, you knew something, this was really a big historical event, but just the sheer tragedy of it. So what Allison asks is, as you were gathering these stories, did you reflect back on the best or most meaningful, memorable story you reported on for the paper? What was it? And did any of those events that you actually covered make the book?
Well, the Samantha Smith thing was one of them, but bear in mind, I was reporting in Maine only for 6 years,
right,
from 1979 to 1985. A lot of the really big things that happened during that era happened like just after I left or just before I got there. For example, the flood of 1987. I missed that. I was trying to think. No, I can't think of anything of earth-shattering significance, I guess. It was mostly local stuff.
We have Rod McGarry just checked in with a question. What did you have to see? That is, get out from behind a desk or computer just to see something you had read about or researched? That's a good question, because I have you hunched over microfilm machines or reading books. Yes. But did you actually get out into the field and reconnect with some of these places?
In most cases, no, because I was working on this book and the newspaper columns during cold weather. It was November through end of January, so a lot of things that I otherwise would have been able to see were covered in snow, and I would have had to drive. It was more productive for me to go to the library than it was to go to the scenes themselves.
Are you one of those guys that can't resist if you see something and you're on the trip or whatever, and you see a sign for a historic this or that? And
absolutely. And I've got another photo that illustrates that. It's about Samuel Champlain. My wife and I took a trip to Newfoundland last year. On the way back, we stopped at the International Historical Park in Robinson. And this shows an artist's conception of Samuel Champlain standing across from Ile St. Croix, where in 1604, the French established what they hoped would be a permanent colony. But a lot of the people died of illness and scurvy. And the next year, they went over to the Nova Scotia mainland and moved the colony over there. This was before Champlain went to Quebec. And one of the reasons that I wanted to see this was because, well, it was right on our way home anyway, but I have a personal connection to Champlain. My mother's mother is of French-Canadian descent, and she and I are the direct descendant of a man named Abraham Martin, who was Champlain's river pilot in Quebec in the mid-1600s. His name is known to every Canadian school child because the battle that decided the outcome of the French and Indian War in 1759 was fought on the Plains of Abraham in Quebec City. They're called that because a century earlier, it was my ancestors' land.
Ah, really?
Yes. And
you were like, where's Waldo?
That's right.
Pop up everywhere here.
All that doesn't buy me a cup of coffee, though. I don't drink coffee, so what the heck.
We have a question from George O'Connor, and I hope this may mean more to you. Did you use any of the Alan Taylor info from Liberty Men and Great Proprietors as sourced material?
Let's see.
If you pull that off the bookshelf, I'm going to faint. There.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, I did.
Well, I think George is going to like that.
Yeah. George is also an old friend, and he didn't prompt me to do this.
Oh,
I
okay.
just happen to have it on the shelf. And Alan Taylor is a historian. He's written many books and has spoken for the Historical Society, but he has a nationwide reputation. And one of the things he talks about in that book is the so-called Malta War, with which George is very familiar. And that's a story that's about the skirmishes that occurred between the Kennebec proprietors, who were distant landowners in Boston who had invested in the property, and local squatters who were settling it. Whenever a surveyor came around, they assumed that he was up to no good, and it was bad news for them. And they ended up killing one of them, which resulted in a trial here in Augusta. This would be the first decade of the 19th century, I believe. Nobody was convicted for it, but civil war almost broke out because of it.
And Marla Hoffman, sounds like she knows you. Good to see you, she says. I'm excited to read your book. And do you have any, and actually a couple other people have asked this too, do you have any other ideas for another book brewing, and can you tell us about that?
Yes, I do. I started working on what I hope will become a book about the coronavirus. I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing about that right now, but the reason I wanted to do this was because when I lived overseas, I met a lot of people in various countries, and I have stayed in touch with many of them. So I figured I was not uniquely positioned, but well positioned to get an idea of how this is affecting people all over the world. So I devised a 28-question survey. I've sent it out to a lot of them, and I've received responses from more than a dozen countries on all inhabited continents. And I'm trying to get somebody in Antarctica too, but we'll see how that goes. I figure I should be done with it sometime this fall.
Great. Well, good for you.
We do have time for one more question, and we do have a hand up.
Okay.
Leslie McVeigh, you are good to go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, Leslie.
She's still muted, I believe.
Let's see. Leslie, you may have to unmute from your side.
I know Leslie, and she's never muted.
Leslie's my cousin.
Okay, hi, sorry. Hi, guys. Roger's with me, so Roger Burley, so he's gonna ask the question.
So I've read every column so far this year, Joe, and
Well, you're the one.
I'm a huge history buff. So briefly, today, maybe it was, you did an extended story on the Penobscots and Passamaquoddies and the legislature. Was that today?
Yes.
Yeah, and you brought the story up to almost today, even though it started in 2019 and went back a ways. So have you done this more often than I've noticed, or is that too tempting to bring something up to the present?
It's not a matter of temptation. I think it's a writer's responsibility not to just leave things hanging and explain how they turned out after that. And that took a lot of time, because very often an event would happen, but I wouldn't be aware of what the next step in the process was. So I'd have to try to do searches that would lead me to whatever the next step was. In the case of the Indian representative to the legislature, I actually called the woman who is the chief of the Maliseets in Aroostook County, because I couldn't find any evidence of what was going on with her. So she told me, and I put it in there.
Is that it, Strawberry, or do we have?
That was our last question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess we're going to wrap it up. Joe, this has been fun. And as I said to you when we spoke back in March, I am just the biggest fan of this work that you've done. I think it, now more than ever, I think it really is a comfort to people, because as we all know, you go to the website, pressherald.com or centralmaine.com, or you pick up the newspaper, and it's all bad news, and it's all about the same topic. And this daily series has just become such a nice little respite for people. Number one, because it has nothing to do with the pandemic, but number two, because it looks back and it enriches us. It gives us a better sense of our state. So I once again want to congratulate you on the series and on the book, which is just out.
My name might appear there, but I'm standing on the shoulders of a lot of people who helped me.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure and I know there's a lot of enthusiasm surrounding this. So the folks listening obviously are aware of On This Date in Maine History. It's at pressherald.com. It's at centralmaine.com and other sites as well, under the Masthead Maine banner. And the book, as I said, it's This Day in Maine is the title. And it's just being published, I believe, just being released this week. Is that right? By Island Port Press?
I believe they're receiving the shipment of the books on Thursday this week.
Okay. And I understand that if people log on to a promotional code, they're going to get your signature on the book too, right?
Yes, I have to drive down there and sign a bunch of books. And
Wear gloves.
that's right. Wear gloves and a mask. Exactly.
That's right. That's right. So that's it for tonight, folks. We do want to mention two things that are coming up in the Maine Voices Live series. This Thursday at 7, actor Timothy Simons. Some of you might know him as one of the stars from Veep, and he's also a University of Maine Orono alum. He'll be speaking live with Portland Press Herald editor Catherine Lee. And then on Tuesday, June 2nd, we are very excited to host Maine astronaut Jessica Meir,
Who's in the book?
who's in the book. That
Yes.
couldn't be better. And as we all know, just returned in April from the space station, International Space Station. So a lot of great events coming up. You can register for them by going to pressherald.com/events, or I believe we're putting up links as well, so you can register for those specific events. But Joe, this has been great. Keep up the good work. You're entertaining us all, you're informing us all, and I think all of Maine is thankful for that.
I'm just wondering what I'm going to do after December 31st.
That's right. Time will go on.
Great.
That's it, everyone. Thanks again. Thanks for joining us, and everybody stay safe and have a good night.